Dr. Joe LeDoux, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
My pleasure.
I interviewed you back on my other podcast some years ago, Wise Counsel. And at that point, it was on the synaptic brain and memory reconsolidation, two books that you had done. And today we're going to talk
that
about
was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was. And a lot of water's gone under the bridge since then for both of us. And particularly interested in a film that you sent me, which helped me to prepare for this interview. So I'll be making reference to that. But first, okay. I'd like to begin with you putting your concerns out there that you've expressed about putting the mental back in mental health. What are you getting at there?
Okay, well, yeah, that's a topic I've been really kind of consumed with lately, and it kind of one way to frame that problem is in terms of something that happened in 1917 and something that happened in 2018, so a century apart. The first thing, 1917, Sigmund Freud said something like, if we could understand anxiety, it would shed light on the whole of mental existence. And then in 2018, some colleagues of mine who were not particularly happy with the way I'd been talking about research on fear and anxiety, said that LeDoux was sending psychiatry back to the dark ages of subjectivity.
Oh, and no, not that.
So, it's an interesting thing because if you follow the history of psychotherapy, of course, Freud had a big role in the early 20th century. But then in the mid 20th century, psychiatry decided it needed to be more scientific. So medications were coming along and so forth.
Yeah.
And who was like testing medications? Well, it was mostly people who had been trained as behaviorists and knew how to test animal behavior, were hired by drug companies, and they would put animals through the testing apparatus. And the idea was, of course, at that time that the mind was irrelevant because all we needed to understand was behavior. And so that was one factor that was going into how psychiatry was going to interpret these results from animal behavior. But the other factor was that psychiatry was trying to put Freud in the rearview mirror in general, because there was kind of a backlash against the whole Freudian thing. But rather than getting rid of the stuff that was kind of a little out there, all the sex and all the things he was talking about that were less acceptable, they got rid of the entirety of subjective experience. So behavior therapy came along, drug therapy came along, cognitive behavior therapy came along eventually. And cognitive behavior was kind of more of a kind of addressing that issue in a sense of putting the mental back into what had been happening for the decade or so before. But as
they kind of shoehorned it in.
They shoehorned it in, but then it kind of became more metric driven anyway, right? So you had to have ways to characterize everything. So it was about measuring behavior, measuring various things, using these metrics to get insurance companies to pay for treatment and so forth. So I think, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a therapist, but I just, I read a lot about this stuff and I try to understand it from the point of view of the brain. And my perspective is that, until we accept that people go to therapy because they feel bad and that changing their behavior can help, but it's not necessarily going to solve the problem of how they feel, we've got a problem.
Yeah. And, as a clinician, I have a particular bias towards subjective behavior or subjective experience, that is.
Right. No. I think every therapist wants to make their patient feel better. The
Sure.
question is, how do you do that, right? And so I think that, when too much is done in a session, for example, if you have a patient with a spider phobia, for example, those patients don't like to see spiders, obviously. So there's a kind of resistance to doing CBT on them and extinction therapy because they have to be in the room with the spider. But suppose you could subliminally present that spider to the person's brain. And we know that those kinds of danger signals will go to the part of the brain I've worked on for a long time, the amygdala. We might be able to extinguish the amygdala subliminally. So the patient wouldn't know the spider is there because it's being presented outside of conscious awareness by the quick flashes and so forth.
Yeah.
And so then metaphorically, we would have tamed the amygdala. I mean, a lot of other parts of the brain are involved in that kind of stuff, but just as a metaphor, think of it as taming the amygdala. Now, once you've done that, then the patient is more comfortable with spiders in the room and talking about them and not being hyper aroused and all of that and jittery. But now you can talk to the patient about their memories about spiders and try to change those memories a bit, like their kind of conception of themselves as someone who's afraid of spiders, and they could see that they have now been released a bit from the spiders by the treatment that was done before. And so you can begin to shape memory. In other words, taming the hippocampus, again, metaphorically, changing memory. Now, once you've done those two things, I think maybe the brain is now ready for good old talk therapy, because you've kind of gotten some of the impediments out of the way.
Yeah.
And I think even medications could be useful there. But my opinion about what medications actually do is it's kind of like you go to a restaurant in New York, where I live, Brooklyn, and the music is always too loud, right? So some old guy like me will ask the waiter to turn it down.
Right.
And so the waiter turns it down. It's the same awful heavy metal song you didn't want to hear in the first place, but it's not as annoying, right? And so I think that's what the drugs might be particularly effective at, is turning down the volume of the state of anxiety. They're not going to get rid of the subjective experience of anxiety, but it's just going to be a little less annoying. So I think there's a lot we can do, but we need to, I think, reconceptualize a lot of the way we've thought about fear and anxiety. And that's what I've been doing in my work since 2012, when I wrote this article called Rethinking the Emotional Brain.
Yeah.
Now,
And so somewhere in there, you got tagged as Mr. Amygdala. And that was part of what you were trying to escape, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I love the amygdala. I think it's it's been very good to me. If you remember Saturday Night Live in the 70s, there was a guy who was on. His name was Derek something or other. I think I forget, but he played this baseball player. Baseball has been very good to me. Baseball has been very good. The amygdala has been very good to me. It's like,
right.
But what it's good for has not been exactly what I was thinking, the way I was thinking about it. I did my PhD studying split brain patients with Mike Gazzaniga in the 1970s. And from that work, I came to think of emotions as cognitive interpretations of situations.
Right.
And so the behavioral and physiological responses that go with fear and anxiety, I thought of as being kind of like these subcortical states that, when they're activated, would trigger some kind of need to cognitively interpret. We're reviewing all of this stuff with split brain patients in terms of cognitive dissonance, that the patient would generate these confabulations to explain why a certain behavior was generated. And that was to reduce the dissonance of that results from the fact that we all believe we have free will. So it's uncomfortable to see our body producing a behavior that we didn't choose, we being the conscious person.
Yeah,
so
describe that a little bit, because you did these experiments in which you showed that the split brain did know something had gone on, but couldn't articulate it.
Right. So basic idea is you present a picture, or we had a patient who could read in both hemispheres, which was unusual. So we were able to put words in the right hemisphere by you flash them to the left side of the visual space. The word goes to the right hemisphere, and normally that word would cross over to the left. But when the brain is split, it stays in the right hemisphere. So if the stand up, it's like 2 words, stand up. The guy would stand up. You say, why'd you do that? He said, oh, I needed to stretch. Now we're talking to the left hemisphere, right? So the left hemisphere didn't know why he stood up, but he stood up, so there must be a reason. So it would generate that explanation. Or if the word was laugh, he'd go, ha ha. We say, why are you laughing? The guy would say, oh, you guys are so funny. And so it was like, never missing a beat. Those explanations were coming out.
Yeah, yeah.
So we propose that, this is not just true of the split brain, but in all of us, a lot of our behavior is controlled unconsciously. And when we unconsciously behave, we've got to, we're fortunate that our brain has some mechanism for generating those rationalizations, those narratives that re-explain everything, that, reduce the dissonance of violating free will. So it allows us to continue to think that we have free will, even when behavior is produced unconsciously. So that was the background from which I went into rat research to try and understand the brain systems that would generate these emotional behaviors that would then require some kind of dissonance reduction in humans. But I was doing it in rats.
Yeah,
and I didn't go looking.
Interestingly, you did not find a fear center, as was suspected, as was thought to exist, an emotional fear center. Rather, it was a byproduct in a way. Tell us about that part.
I found that it's not that I had to find the amygdala as being involved in fear, because that had been around for a long time before. What I did was I discovered ways that sensory information gets to the amygdala and ways that the emotional responses come out. And so it was natural for people, including me, to talk about the amygdala as a fear center, but I called it an implicit fear center. And that the conscious experience of fear would be what the cortex was doing.
Yeah.
But that distinction didn't hold. People just didn't grab the implicit explicit distinction the way they did in the case of memory. So you got implicit memory in the cerebellum, in the basal ganglia, and so forth. But you couldn't have implicit emotion or implicit fear in the amygdala. People didn't want to hear that. It was more like the amygdala is a fear center, and there was no distinction between implicit and explicit. And that became part of the NIMH industry of studying the amygdala to try and find cures for addiction, for fear and anxiety, for autism, all kinds of things. And, I was part of that. My work was part of generated some of the data, a lot of the data that went into the popularity of the amygdala being involved in fear. And I'd be introduced as having been as someone who had discovered how fear comes out of the amygdala. And I kept saying, no, that's not exactly the case. But, I didn't make a big deal out of it. But after decades of being introduced that way, and the field kind of running away with this idea that the amygdala is making fear, I decided I had to do something. That's when I wrote that paper, Rethinking the Emotional Brain. Yeah. And that's where I said that it's not fear. What the amygdala is a defensive survival circuit. It's an ancient circuit that can detect and respond to danger. It allows every vertebrate animal, which every vertebrate has an amygdala. So in every vertebrate, from fish through amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, all of these vertebrates have an amygdala that can detect and respond to danger. Now, if we go to invertebrates, and they don't have an amygdala, but they have their own defensive survival circuits that allow them to detect and respond to danger. Yeah, and even if we go to
this is something that has amazed me of late, and something that you observe in your work is that the smallest little creatures will avoid getting hurt and scurry away. And so, I find that there are bugs that don't belong in the house, and I'm inclined to squash them. Well, they're not inclined to be squashed.
Yeah.
And they're amazing how quickly
Well,
they
yeah.
flee.
That goes back pretty far in nature. I wrote a book called The Deep History of Our Cells, the 4 billion year story of how we got conscious brains. And I traced the history of danger all the way back to the earliest forms of life,
Yeah,
bacterial cells that were, some of the early, they're the oldest kinds of bacteria, the oldest kinds of cells that are still with us on Earth today. And the first bacterial cell that ever lived billions of years ago, almost 4 billion years ago, had to be able to detect and respond to danger to stay alive long enough to reproduce and generate another bacterial cell, right? They split in half and that becomes the next cell. But if you don't live long enough to do that because something else gets in your way, for example, a high concentration of acid that you might be kind of swimming around, if you can't detect that acid and move away from it, then you're not going to live long enough to reproduce. So you have to be able to detect danger and move away from it. And you have to detect nutrients and move towards them. So
yeah,
those are survival capacities that are as old as life and have nothing to do with psychology.
right. They're
Psychology
very
is
deep.
psychology is an interpretation we apply to behavior. And so
Uh-huh.
even in humans, let's take the kinds of behaviors we have. We have innate reflexes. That has nothing to do with fear, right? That's just like you startle or you freeze. Well, freezing is more like an instinct or a fixed action pattern, as the ethologist would call it. So we've got two levels there: reflexes and instincts. Another level is habits that we start out doing them methodically, but then they become automatic. None of that is going to trigger fear because it's all habitual, right? Or it's all automatic. Fear comes in when you have the ability to cognitively interpret the situation that you're in. And some organisms that can cognitively interpret that situation can also be conscious that they are interpreting it that way. So those are the levels of control that come about. And only if you can be conscious of what's going on can you be afraid. If you don't know it's happening to you, you can't be afraid.
Yeah. Okay, now I want to switch gears because I promised our audience that you are a very complex person and have had a very full life. So I want and I had the benefit of this film about your life, which is one of the extraordinary things that's happened for you. And I learned some things that I certainly didn't know. I knew that you had a long-standing passion for music because I knew about your group, the Amygdaloids, but
Yeah.
I didn't know where that came from the fact that you grew up in Cajun country and in fact are of, I guess, Cajun origin.
I'm a Cajun, yes.
You are a
I mean,
Cajun.
in Louisiana, South Louisiana, where the Cajuns live, it didn't matter so much. It didn't matter so much what your past was. If you lived there a couple of generations, if you had your family live there a couple of generations, you became Cajun. So my mother's family was Italian and German, but they'd been there for a while, and so they were Cajun. My father's family was French on both sides, though. So I'm like a kind of Euro trash blend of Italian, German, and French. And
Yeah. Yeah.
but the time that I was growing up, I was born in 1949, post World War II, and the parents of that generation wanted their kids to be American. World War II just ended. It was a great success for the U.S., blah, blah, blah. So everybody wanted to be gung-ho American. And my generation didn't get taught Cajun French. So that's something
Oh,
I
that's
kind of
too
regret.
bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, they tried when I was 12 to make me learn, but I bet my mind was going in other directions then.
Yeah. But you were deeply involved in the music and touched by the music during your growing up years, and then you kind of got away from it for a while. But this leads us to another topic taken up in the movie is that I'm trying not to cough here. is that your dad was a butcher, and therein lies your initial familiarity with the brain. Tell us
Right.
about your brain job.
Yeah. So as a little kid, I would hang out in the meat market. My job, one of my jobs, I guess the main one, was to take my little fingers and reach into the brain. You could see where the bullet had gone in. This is the way they would. Actually, the bullet didn't kill the cows, but it would stun them. It was a 22 rifle. So that has a very small little piece of lead in it, and it would go into the animal's head and stun them enough to where the animal could then be kind of out of it and butchered in the traditional sense. But you could see the bleeding where the bullet had gone into the once you've taken the brain out. And so my job was to go in there with my fingers and pull the lead out without damaging the tissue too much, because brains were a delicacy and it would be sold in the meat market. So it's best if it looked pretty nice. So I would just pull those things out. And I learned from doing that about the cerebral hemisphere. I didn't know what anything was called, but I knew you could pull those two parts apart and they would just, the hemispheres would just kind of come off. Cerebellum you could rip off as well in the back. And then there was a kind of stalk that, was what I would now call the brainstem and hypothalamus and thalamus that was sticking up there from what was left. But I didn't know any of that at the time. It certainly didn't then I'm going to become a brain scientist. No, nothing like that. I went off to college, studied, I got an undergraduate degree in business administration and a master's in marketing. And while studying marketing, I got interested in questions about psychology. And because, I wanted to, it was the late 60s and it wasn't very cool to be involved in business and marketing. But I found an angle, consumer protection, that I could be involved in and kind of have some, self-respect and not be just like an outsider amongst all my other friends who are politically active and hippies, business, consumer protection was a good angle. And I learned a lot about psychology and learned all about Skinner. Skinner was a big fan of mine when I was first learning. I just loved the systematicity of everything. And so I wrote to him, and it must have been in the late 60s, early 70s. I wrote to him and said I wanted to develop a model of consumer behavior based on his principles. And he wrote back and said, well, thank you for considering, but I don't like the idea of using my work to sell products. That's not what I wanted to help consumers. But anyway, his message to me was, part of what kind of pushed me to get out of the whole business thing, because I really wanted to learn more about psychology.
Yeah,
I still have that.
Yeah, and that's a good keepsake. I actually saw him on the corner in Boston or Cambridge, and but I didn't have the nerve to say anything to him. I couldn't think of anything to say, but he was very distinctive looking guy. Yeah, you couldn't mistake him for anybody else.
So I went on to do my dissertation in marketing on my PhD my master's thesis in marketing on post-purchase cognitive dissonance. And so I pretended to work for a car company. They gave me a list of their recent purchasees and their phone numbers. And so half of the list I called and acted like I was so I'm working on the behalf of the car company, wanted to make sure everything was going right. And if they had any problems, just let me know. We'd take care of it. The other half I didn't call at all. So the half that got called seemed to have more, consumer satisfaction in the months after in the purchase than those that I didn't call. So that was my introduction to Leon Festinger and cognitive dissonance. And when I got to Stony Brook and worked with Mike Kazanica for my PhD, I had no idea that cognitive dissonance would be like the main theme of my PhD dissertation as well, which is the post behavior. And unconscious behaviors generating this dissonance that required cognitive interpretation to reduce the dissonance. Yeah. So that was a kind of interesting little connection between the two.
Yeah, as well, an amazing thread there that comes back into your life. And
Yeah.
also you started doing, you got back into bands during during high school. You formed some bands.
Yeah, yeah, and
And
I wasn't that into Cajun music as a kid because it was kind of old man's music, but I did develop a fondness for it that I have in adult life. But I was fascinated with music. I'd go to bed with a transistor radio in my ear every night, and I became a disc jockey in high school. But I also had a couple of bands. One of them was called the Countdowns, and the Countdowns were it was a kind of 60s thing, Countdowns. And we weren't that good. We could only play like blues-based songs like the Rolling Stones would generate. But there was another band in town that could do the Beatles impeccably. And I'm still in touch with one of those guys that was in that. He actually made it into the Louisiana Music Hall of Fame, which is quite a feat
wow,
given the nature of music in Louisiana. So that's kind of
wow,
fun. But in
wow.
college, here's an interesting thing. In college, we had this one night where we put together this kind of air guitar band. And again, this is long before I had any indication that I was interested in the brain. But I remembered the brain from the butcher market thing. And we called this band Cerebellum and the Medullas. That was my first brain-based band name. Little did I
Wow.
know that I would later have a band named the Amygdaloids.
Yeah, yeah, you really had some themes running in your life. And we've gone into uh, some of the psychological work that your life took, the direction that it took. Um, at some point, you got married. Where did that happen?
Well, I got married once when in college. That didn't last too long. I had the 7 year itch. But my true love of my life, my wife Nancy Princenthal, we met in 1980 here in New York, and 3 weeks later took a 3 week trip to Italy, and never separated after that.
Yeah, wow, wow. Now, another important chapter is the death of your first son, Jacob. And what can you share with us about that?
Well, I don't want to go into too much detail, but he had a problem with drugs, especially heroin, and we didn't know about it until the very end. And he overdosed as a 17-year-old, and so it was an
Yeah.
awful thing.
Well, I gather that you went through some period of grief after that. And I have the feeling that the music was part of your healing eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the first song I ever wrote after Jacob died. It was about him, of course, and then I, just kept finding music to be kind of a healing experience to play with. I was never a great guitarist or a songwriter or a singer or anything, but when I started writing songs, it opened up this new world for me because I could never really sing a song that somebody else wrote, but I could sing my songs because they were written in the key and in the range, the vocal range in which I am capable of. So that was an eye opener that it's really, if you narrow it down to what you can do, and this is true of anything in life, right? You start with something you can do, and then you can build on that and go
Yeah,
further with it.
yeah,
So it
yeah,
doesn't matter if you're not that good at something, you can find some angle to approach it if you really like it.
yeah. And your musical life has been very full, and it even gave you chances to meet some famous musicians. Tell
Yeah, I've
us who
had
you met and who you worked with.
who I met. Well, I guess like the biggest highlight in terms of famous musicians was my meeting of Rosanne Cash. And I had invited Roseanne to which the way we met was that my book editor at Viking was her book editor at Viking, and she had a brain tumor, and she was writing a kind of memoir about that experience. And Rick said, "Well, would you like to meet my other author who works on the brain?" And she said, "Yeah." So we met and had a good conversation, had I think we met at a Mexican restaurant in Chelsea in New York, and had a good conversation. And then, a few weeks later, I wrote, I guess I called her. I don't know if we had email back then. I guess we did, but I called her and said, Roseanne, I'd like you to, if you could participate in this benefit we're doing at a music club in New York called Rocket Science, ROCKIT Science.
Yeah.
And we had a great lineup of musicians in that. Rufus Wainwright and Dee Snider from Twisted Sister, all kinds of crazy musicians. It was a lot of fun. Lenny Kaye was in it. And Roseanne agreed to be the headliner, but then she called at the last minute and said, my agent is, booked me in Germany and I'm going to have to go. I'm really sorry. And you know how you never say the right thing at the right time when you feel like, oh, I should have said that. This is the only time in my life where I said what I should have said. I said, well, would you sing on my album instead? And she was like caught. She said, yes, of course. So we were generating this album. The album actually was produced by the same company that did the film that you were talking about. The film's called The Neuroscience of Emotions, the Life, Work, and Music of Dr. Joseph LeDoux. But the same company produced my album called Theory of My Mind. So take off on Theory of Mind, of course. And on that on that album is a song called Mind Over Matter, which Roseanne sings backup vocals on. And another song called
You remind me of me now.
I haven't thought about this song in such a long. I'd never play it. It's a sentence to death for crime of passion. That's what it's called.
Oh yeah.
So it's a crime of passion. Blah blah. And Roseanne, she's singing in the background. Crime of passion is. So it's a lot of fun. It's not like we played together in that sense, but because when you record music, everybody records their part separately, and you just put it all together. But we did have an event at NYU a few years ago where she and I had a conversation, and then we played together. Also joining me at that was my co-conspirator in acoustic music, Colin Dempsey. We have a group called So We Are, and we've traveled all over the world as So We Are, because I'll be invited to give a lecture in, Norway. And they'll say, can you bring the amygdaloids? I'll say, no, but I can bring Colin. So Colin has come with me to Scandinavia and Mexico, Italy, all over the place.
Now, is that repertoire based on brain science, or do you branch out?
Yeah, for the most part, we are the acoustic amygdaloids, basically. Yeah. And there's some other songs we play, but mostly it's amygdaloid songs. The amygdaloids at this point is more of a kind of thought or idea rather than an actual band. The whole band played together on the first two albums, but after that, and then there are like 5 more albums after that. It's just been me and whoever I could put together.
Yeah, but still doing the basic
same
songs, science, same kind of songs. The science
we created our own genre in this field here. It's called heavy mental.
I love that.
So all the songs most of them are love songs about mind and brain and mental disorders. But if you think about it, most rock songs are love songs about mind and brain and mental disorders. So it's not that different.
Right.
It's just the title says mind, or there's a little bit of mind and brain in there. But I kind of exhausted the genre though. So right now I'm working on a suite of 6 songs called just love stories, and they're nothing about mind and brain except the implicit.
Yeah. Now also, you have three of your songs are in a Werner Herzog.
Werner Herzog has a documentary that is floating around at various film festivals right now. It's called Theater of Thought, and the Theater of Thought, I think. And he interviews a bunch of people. I think his documentary style is he starts and he sees where it goes. So this documentary started out, I think, about AI or something like that. It went around and they were having a conversation in, I don't know, somewhere in Seattle or someplace one night after a shoot. And two of the cameramen on that shoot had been on a shoot in my office for some podcast right before that. And they told Werner that he should talk to me. So I got a call at 7:00 on Saturday night from a colleague who was the science advisor of this thing. And he said, can Werner Herzog come to you on Monday? And at that point, I was upstate in the Catskills. I said, sure, come to our house in the Catskills. We'll have the interview, then we'll have some wine and cheese outside on the deck. So they showed up on Monday afternoon. He said, okay, start playing your guitar while we set up. So I start playing, play this song, play that song, play this song. And he said, okay, that one. So the song he picked was called Map of Your Mind. And that is in the video. But he also used two other songs, one called When the Night is Dark, for someone who is practicing tightrope walking. This is the guy who walked between the World Trade Centers a long time ago. And so his tightrope walking in this this part of the video is perfectly timed to the song When the Night is Dark. I lose my fear and all that kind of stuff. So those two are in it. And then the last song that's in it is Running Over the Credits of the movie. Now, that's a song I've had to disavow because it talks about the amygdala as being the seat of fear. So I'd be I wouldn't be true to myself if I was still doing that song. But, for Werner Herzog, I let it go.
Yeah, yeah. One of the moments that I thought was delightful in the movie is your wife saying that she had no idea that she was going to be marrying a rock star. Here she thought she was
married a neuroscientist.
a neuroscientist. And then Gazzaniga, do I have his name right? Yeah. Gazzaniga?
Yeah, close enough.
Dr. Gazzaniga remarked that he felt that it was very instrumental, no pun intended, that you tend to use both sides of your brain, if you will. That's been
and the top and bottom as well.
Yeah, that's been endemic to your life, and I thought that was an interesting point as well.
Yeah,
and then a play has been written about 15 of your songs.
Right. So a playwright in San Francisco took 15 of my songs and created the arc of a musical play based on them. And we just did, like a couple of weeks ago, we did a reading in San Francisco at the Marsh Theater, which was a tremendous amount of fun. We had great actors in there. It's not at a reading, the actors are not performing. They're reading their lines and singing the songs and so forth, and being theatrical in their presentation. But it's mostly just sitting down just to see how it all goes. It's kind of a practice thing, and it went really well. So we're pursuing it. We're trying to find someone who will help support the actual production of a real play, because that's a much bigger deal than just having some people sitting around, reading. So, but it was fun. I played guitar in it. Colin Dempsey, my partner in crime, was there playing with me. And there was a drummer from out there in in San Francisco playing. And there's just the three of us and the crew, the cast.
Wow. So where's it going next? Do you have any idea? Such an extraordinary life and so expansive.
I'm closing my lab in August. I've done enough research. It's it's been a good run, but it's so hard to raise money and to worry about having to pay young people, and you never know with with research, whether you're going to have money next year or not, because it's
Yeah.
just hard to budget. We're not businessmen, and we just, I had some background in business, but I didn't learn that much. So, yeah. So I decided I want to spend more time doing the things I really want to do, more writing and music and plays and whatever it comes along.
Yeah. A gentleman philosopher.
I'm not retiring from NYU. I'll still, take a couple of years to wind everything down there. But I'll probably retire in a couple of years. So.
Yeah. Well, can I have permission to send the link, to put the link that you sent me, the no trouble involved link, to the to your movie about you and your work? Can I put that in the show notes?
Sure. And then, yeah, I think that's fine. I don't think you could, I'm not sure you could like repost it on your site. But you could certainly put it in the notes. That would be great.
No, I think what I'm talking about is reposting it on my site.
The link, but like that you can activate the link from your site. That's probably fine. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
as long as it's not in the video here.
Yeah. No, it won't be in the video.
Yeah. I'll just ask the producer and just clear it with them and let you know. But I'm sure it's fine because it's a public link, so it's available for anybody.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. And also, I wanted to share it with you. Mentioned your partners in crime, and Amanda, a mutual friend.
Amanda Thorpe?
Yeah, Amanda Thorpe.
Oh, how do you know Amanda?
She introduced you and me. She's the one who got us together. I said, he's not going to be interested in talking to me. And,
I forgot.
Lo and behold, you were.
That's great.
Yeah. How do you two know each other? She says that she's made music with you.
Yeah, she was the bassist in the Amygdaloids for a couple of years. Right. Wow. During our last years in New York. Yeah. And so we wrote some songs together. We're good friends. Right now, in the fall, I spent 5 weeks in London on sabbatical at London School of Economics. And I'm going back for 7 weeks in the spring, and we're going to have a gig in London that she's organizing right now.
Oh, great.
I love Amanda. She's so wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you reminded me of that connection.
Yeah. Well, I found her absolutely charming. And particularly, she sent me a couple of clips of her playing some music.
She's fantastic, incredible singer.
Yeah. And I found her absolutely sexy and beguiling. Her performance. There are 20 years great. Between us, so there's no danger there. Okay. Well, I think we've done it here. Can you think of anything else that you'd like to say?
No, this has been great. Thank you.
Okay. It's been a pleasure.